Hello, everyone. Welcome to another discussion for the SF Masterworks reading group. This is a series where we talk about the sci-fi masterworks in the order they were published as masterworks. We normally read one book per month. The book for May was The Rediscovery of Man, but we couldn't get to recording it in May, so we'll have two discussions in June. The next three books coming up are Last and First Men for June by Olaf Stapledon, Earth Abides by George R. Stewart for July, and we have our first time repeat author Philip K. Dick with Martian Timeslip. I let the group introduce themselves first before we get into what I'm sure is going to be a very interesting discussion. Jared, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, I'm Jared. I run the Fantasy Thinker YouTube channel and also do some occasional blogging on pagechewing.com. Chris.
Nice. My name's Chris Mohan. I run the YouTube channel Chronicle of Chris. I also not blogging but participating in the discussions on PageTune forum, and we also part of the Speculative Speculations Sci-fi podcast as well, with many of the fine people here as well.
Hello, my name is Suzana Imaginario. I'm author and I run a YouTube channel called Pen of the Weird.
Very nice. So this was different from what we normally read because this was, well, what we have read so far, not what we normally read. I'm sure there are other short story collections, but this one is a collection of short stories. So rather than go talk through the short stories one by one, we each picked one that we particularly want to talk about, and then we'll discuss overarching themes and maybe cover some of the other stories as they come up in our discussion. So I think the short stories that we have picked, I had them written down just before we started recording, but we have picked Ballad of the Lost Smell, Mother Hitten's Little Kittens, and The Game of Rat and Dragon. What order should we talk about these in first?
Start go chronologically through the book, probably, I think.
Yeah.
More so than anything else.
That's fair.
And we also had The Crime and Glory of Commander Shostel, which was
yeah.
Susanna's pick. Or
Okay,
not pick,
right.
as the case may be.
Time and Glory. Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I forgot to write that down. Anyway, so that means we start with The Game of Rat and Dragon. That was my pick. Maybe I'll start with why it was my best story, and then we can talk about it. So, The Game of Rat and Dragon. Well, first, I think the reveal about the partners being cats, I think, was wonderful. It gave me a lot of joy for some reason. And then in the previous stories, like it just made sense that cats are saving humanity or like helping humans travel in space. And I think in the previous two stories, we've encountered various aspects of why it is terrible to travel in space, and we've seen various sacrifices, quote unquote, that humanity has made to be able to be in space. We start with the Scanners Live in Vain story, where humans are basically like cut out, like have their body parts cut out of them, and like I also really liked the opening of the book in The Man in a Rage because he wants to feel something, which I think is a recurring theme that we'll probably talk about later. And I forget, yeah, the lady of the soul, the lady who drove the soul, that also introduced this concept of, or expanded a little bit on the concept of the things that are horrible in space without, they mentioned them without expanding on them.
Yeah.
And then having them be expanded as these strange creatures who looked like dragons to humanity and rats to cats. That I think was again fascinating, and I think it also had some interesting strangeness to it, like strangeness of the kind I liked, and not so much strangeness of the kind I wasn't sure about later in the book, like the ships travel in two-dimensional space. What the heck is up with that? But just to think about, that's fascinating. And so it almost feels like the dragons and the rats are like some collapsed shapes in space, which anyway, it just was a lot of fun to think about overall for me. So that was my favorite story in the collection.
Yeah, you get a lot of the the weird and wonderfulness in that story, I think, along with the idea that you're kind of lost a little bit because it's kind of so far outside of what we would consider, I think, to be like modern space sci-fi in some ways. You know, it's not about the technology and the fast and light travel, it's about the cats. And it's about the
Yeah.
cats eating people, and it's about lots of other things that aren't really a part of that. It's about romance in some of the other stories. It's about kind of things that we recognize in some things as being part of early or modern, as in today, life on Earth, but
Mm.
sort of transplanted into space in some ways. So like we sort of wanted like cats, so we brought them with us and populated space with cats, you know, as being an idea, which for me is absolutely horrifying of all sorts. But as I found through my reading at the moment, between spiders in space and cats in space and ants in space, I'm started on board
Okay.
with some of this repopulation.
Right. Spiders aren't so horrible
Yeah.
when you're evolved creatures who want
Yeah.
to do science.
And the size of men as well. You know, if you
Yeah.
just make them really large, apparently they're not as scary. I don't believe that for
Uh,
a second.
Yeah.
And I also really liked the ambiguous ending of it. I think because we've been introduced, I think if I interpreted it correctly, the weird shapes resemble dragons to humans and rats to cats. So it almost felt like the man with the nurse at the end was talking to a cat who he saw as female. There were parts about that. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, so there's your first, and this is one of the things, but you just actually saying this. This is one of the reasons I think actually going through the stories again would make an awful lot of sense, because obviously smell is a homunculi. So all of these things that were beasts of burden that
Mm,
were transformed and used science to be turned into human beings. I have this sense that if I go through the book again and read all the stories again, that actually you will see the genesis of a lot of these ideas, or a lot of the ideas coming into effect. Like one of the stories I don't think we're going to talk about, no, it does come later, will be the idea that they repopulated the cats and made them obviously evolve over time, a bit like we were talking about. That could have
mhm,
been the way the homunculi were originally kind of sourced as being, you know, that they became more humanoid in essence. But
mm.
again, we don't get the intervening space between these stories. We just kind of get this little snapshot of time of what humanity's doing around that time. But like you say, exactly right, that he's talking to the cat, but the cat actually could be a humanoid
Yeah,
person, or
yeah,
probably other people.
yeah. Yeah, that was, I think, somewhat trippy. But with that said, there were parts of the story that I didn't like. I mean, um, we could potentially write it off as the perspective of this character and not necessarily what the author is thinking. But he thinks to himself at one point that there is no female mind, like female woman, human female mind, that is as complex as this cat's, which could be giving a lot of credit to the cat or not thinking very highly
Woman hating,
female
yeah, yeah.
of the female mind. And based on some like how women are always described, I was joking about this before we started recording, like this is a breast first description. I don't know if it does not necessarily reflect the author's opinion himself, but he does have characters in prominent female roles and so on. So I don't think I would conclude that it's the author's opinion of women until I know more, but it did jar a little bit to read that.
Yeah, it's right in the last line of that story. That viewpoint, and it's kind of it is jarring. Yeah, you know, you can call it a product of its time. It was written in the 50s, um, and you know, try to work around that, I guess. But that is in there just for the discerning reader if they need any kind of flag or something like that that they had to have before they read the book. It is in there. It's, you know, so it's but then the rest of the book, though, it's these stories, like Chris was saying, they're they're all tied together somehow. And if you look at the back of the book, there is a timeline that
Mm.
gives you the years like thousands and thousands of years that have passed kind of in between all these stories. So that is kind of fascinating what you said about how they back then it's just cats that are
Mm.
used for their reflexes in space travel, and then in the future they're actually the cats have become they're actually fighting for their rights to be treated as well as humans,
Yeah.
and this theme keeps going throughout the book as it goes along, that it becomes more and more prominent that there's a class struggle here, or a species struggle, if you will, um, to get equality for the under species, or the under what they call them, under something, whatever,
Under
Under
people, under people.
under
Yeah.
people, yeah. And so that's a lot of this story was by itself, it's so throwaway funny.
Yeah.
No, like you wouldn't it would seem to have no value by itself, without it being tied into everything else that comes afterwards, and other than just being something that was amusing somewhat.
And I think you've sort of hit on some of the stuff that kind of jars up against, because at the start, a lot of this bit seems very of its time, if you know what I mean, like the attitudes to women, etc., the whole way through. But I think by the time you get to the end of the book, I think the whole book is sort of a commentary on how evolved humanity had become in the almost utopian level society, yet their attitudes to whether women at some stage, whether cats or animals at other stage, whether it's under people at later stage, prisoners by the very end of the story, is all very circumspect and not great. To the point that they just kind of pigeonhole people into roles and kind of say that's what you're doing without ever really redressing that or kind of coming together at some stage to say, actually, is this what should be happening here of a highly evolved society in some way? And the fact that people felt trapped and stuck within that civilization in the roles, and that obviously led to problems and things later on.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I come to the point that this is actually quite brilliant in a lot of ways, because as you 100% rightly say, Jared, these stories in isolation are weird, off-kilter tales, just kind of like what I just read. And it's only when you start to piece it all together that you start to think, actually, there's a fabric laid across here, across all these bits of little instances through time that you can see through the timeline of where this society supposedly changed and evolved, but actually became more and more problematic as it went on. Like, it just created more and more problems for itself and how it's processing. I just think it's completely
Yeah.
fascinating.
Well, you mentioned the word utopia.
Yeah.
And that is but he constantly points out how false that is. It's a false utopia. It's only a
Yeah.
utopia for those who are the instrumentality,
Yes.
and those who are running the universe, and it's not a utopia at all.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
it's quite the opposite, actually, if you really want to delve into how dystopic some of these societies are, especially like that long crazy story where they went to the middle of the earth or whatever it was. I don't remember the name of the place, but it was so he was he's setting up this instrumentality as this utopia vehicle, and then he points out all the cracks in it and takes it apart. He picks it apart story by story as it goes along. And like we'll get to my favorite story in here too, but it's hard to actually say it's a favorite, other than as the stories went on. Once we got past the two really long ones in here, I thought the stories at the end were way better than the ones at the beginning. And I don't know if that's because it just tied everything up better, or if he just got better as a writer and started to say, okay, I'm going to write stuff that makes a little more sense. And
he's coming off his drugs at that stage, possibly.
or
he'd taken just enough drugs maybe at that stage for
just enough, who knows what he could self-prescribe, but yeah, so it was fascinating to watch that evolution of not only of the characters and the society he created, but of the writing of the his evolution as a writer and putting all this together into one. I don't want to say cohesive universe because it wasn't
It's
very
definitely not.
cohesive,
No.
but at least into a single entity of some sort.
Yeah. I think that was one of the things that I did really like about this book as a whole. Emerging the picture that emerged from the individual stories. I think it wasn't like we can the instrumentality was never properly described, or there was or the under people how they came about. We don't get origins or explanations for many of these things. They just are, but you can still build this picture of society. You can build, even without the timeline, you can build what, like you said, Chris, like a picture of like how this evolved and changed. They played whack-a-mole with their problems. They solved one, created others. And I think the overarching themes, there are several, but the one I think I appreciated the most and I thought were best handled by the author were the ones around, to a certain extent, taking away various freedoms. And there were freedoms of different kinds. Like with the first story, for instance, Scanners Live in Vain, we see that prisoners or criminals don't get a say in whether they become, I don't remember whether Scanners or the other one were the nicer things, were the gentlemen, and the prisoners didn't have a say in serving the way Scanners did, which is a horrible way to continue living. Maybe death is better. And we see almost a similar parallel in the last story, the planet called Sheol, in which they have to grow body parts and stuff. It's terrible. Both of those sentences are worse than death, I think. And in both of them, I think the people contemplate death. People who are subjected to this, they would much rather die than live on like this. So the taking away of that freedom, or later on where humans are forcefully drugged to stay happy, I think that's an oppression of its own kind. Like and again, this theme around, is it better to feel even bad things rather than continue living in perpetual fake happiness? And the distinction between that and robots, I think the parallels between robots, yeah, I think there were many things in terms of overarching themes that I thought were done really, really well. So I could pick parts of the book that I thought were wonderful and appreciate a whole lot, but somehow put together as a whole, I have very mixed feelings about the book.
Yeah, I think that's very very true. All of it, and like you say, liberty is very much at the heart of these stories. It's very much the idea of what people consider happiness to be. There's numerous stories where they look at, again, this sort of utopian society from the instrumentalities point of view, where they think everybody's happy in our civilization, and they basically control the minds, so they always output happiness, if you know what I mean, without having any underlying happiness. But they're just looking at like almost the spreadsheet version of happiness to say, actually, here's where it, and that's when the exploration of when he actually goes to view what happiness looks like in the ground, and he goes, I was right, when he goes to do it. And even things like free food and drink for humanoids, they basically just hit a lamppost and the free food and drink comes out like it's not that, but not for under people. They have to have their own currency and their own system, and for them to do. And if they're too poor, they just get gassed. And I was thinking, this was written mid-50s. This is pretty much an allegory for the war as well. And a lot of people, this worth of people, this class of people that like a ruling class or something says that this group of people have no use or function in society because they can't contribute to the big machine, even though the machine never wanted them in the first place, or society never wanted them in the first place, other than to fulfill such a basic need or function around the place. And there's just so much happening around that, but it's wrapped up in this world of rats and cats and bulls that being as human, and sex workers in some kind of places, and all sorts of weird and wonderful nonsense that is flying about the pages of these books, that is sometimes, I think, it sort of gets lost and obfuscated.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I think it's almost there as a distraction, the other stuff, to like sort of one way I was thinking about it yesterday was when you sneak in vegetables with more interesting food to feed kids. It's almost like that to a certain extent.
It is. Yeah.
Except I'm not sure the interesting stuff works very well for me.
Yeah.
But on the subject we were just discussing, since we were already on the topic of the under people and like societal improvements, should we do your story first, Chris? Because I think that fits in nicely with what we're talking, and then we can go back to the other two.
So the Ballad of the Lost Smell, which is the second last story in the book, kind of sort of follows two characters. One is Smell, who is one of these cat humanoid people, who's interestingly whose father, Samacintosh, is somebody that was a well-known sportsman or athlete or something, and he sort of bridged both worlds of the under people, which Smell was the kind of homunculi, and the people that were humanoid, because he kind of straddled both worlds. And so when he died, there was representation from both. But she is essentially a sex worker, I think, just but is the way that she's portrayed. You know, she's a girly girl, as keeps on saying, and she dresses provocatively. And there's a whole lot of really interesting things about this. And I think, again, this ties back to some of the previous stories in some ways, about the story about the beautiful woman that became very hideous by the end. It's sort of intimated that actually over time, and because people live a long time in this world now, that you're sort of prescribed a number of years that you're going to live, is that humanoids actually had to change how they look like in order to fit in the different civilizations they were living in or otherwise. So they weren't really recognizable the human anymore, whereas the homunculi were, and they were the ones that were dressing provocatively. They were the ones that were supposed to be kind of tempting to people. But the basis of that story is there's a guy called Gentacost. Yeah, Gentacost is his name, and he sees the fallacy of the utopia. He sees the fallacy of the system and wants to create a more equal and an egalitarian society. And he button up against, he can't get anywhere with anybody with the ruling classes together, but he vehemently believes. And at the heart of it, there seems to be another faction or another level going on. This kind of E. Kelly Telly character, which, again, I have theories about all of this in terms of actually what all of this meant, right? Anybody else, before I kind of give you what I think, anybody have any ideas about between this and the previous story, which was Alpha Ralpha Boulevard, where they get the prediction, you have 21 minutes to love this woman, that kind of stuff, how all that works?
Yeah, that was so strange. And it's funny because it mentions that Gentacost is a big figure in the history of mankind. If you look at the timeline, his name is mentioned as a he's instrumental to the rediscovery of man and the holy insurgency and stuff like that. And so it's but you read this story and you don't really get that big a sense of his place in the history of mankind other than inference, because the story itself, I forget actually how it ended up, because he used Smell as a diplomat of sort, right?
Yes, so she was used as a vehicle for him to get into the chamber, essentially, so that Kelly Telly could start to manipulate the systems of the instrumentality in some ways. Yeah. They were looking down at the cameras or whatever that were seeing all the people below them. So she was used as like almost like Helena Troy in a weird way to kind of go in and tell her story, kind of to get them to open up, because they eventually just throw her out and say, "You've wasted our time," but the damages or the thing has been opened out at that stage to do what they wanted to do.
Right. And so that is actually a much bigger event in the history than like right then they just, like you said, they just throw out and they say, "Get out of here." And then, but like I said, the seed was been planted. And so that ends up being such a bigger event, but you don't get that just from the story. You have to read on and then get the bigger picture from all the stories and figure out exactly. So that was the genius part of the book, is that you take these little hints all throughout them, and then once you get it all, you're like, "Oh, okay, there's a bigger picture here."
Yeah.
But we don't have it. We don't have.
He never finished it, or it never was there.
Well, he went on to write a novel called Australia after this, and I think that's probably and that's mentioned in the timeline. And that
Yes, it
probably
is.
is what explains this whole thing. But we don't get that here. But the sense that it is there is, you know, is the genius, but it's a mad genius.
Yeah.
This guy had to have some kind of madness to write all this stuff. But it's cool though.
Yeah.
This the story was also nice because it sort of had connecting threads to other stories besides the ones you already mentioned, Chris. The
Yeah.
um in the Dead Lady of Clown Town, one of the instrumentality ladies goes all up in a rage. It's I'm going to have kids and they are going to solve this problem for the future generations. And she named them Lord Gentacost, I think, or not the Lord, but Gentacost. And then I think every child they had afterwards was called the same. And that whole, I guess, generation, yeah, that whole hierarchy of children um, worked towards the improvement of mankind, I think. So that was nice. And then it had the immediate previous connection to, well, actually, this was it's mentioned in the opening paragraph, I think, the lady Alice Moore, but I don't remember what role she played in the actual story. It was mostly just Gentacost and Smell, right? It
Yeah.
wasn't, she wasn't involved. Was she in the room maybe when they had the, yeah. But anyway, like she was briefly mentioned before because the, not Alpha Alpha, the other one where they went deep underground, that lady became Alice Moore. And
Right.
so, anyway, so yeah, I like those little back references to.
Yeah. And this is also, it is the second last story, was the first time they ever told us what the rediscovery of
Mm,
man actually was, which was the fact that they basically went back to what our society today was, or certainly 1950s, 60s was,
Right.
which
Yeah.
they went to back to the idea that you could get sick, the idea that you could die, the idea that we'll have newspapers and we'll have, all of this kind of like almost nostalgia for how things used to be in some ways. And so they were sort of living. My idea of the whole thing is, I maybe it'll be in Australia, maybe we'll get to it or otherwise. They were almost certainly living in a singularity for me. They are not living in a world at all. They are living in a designed universe, because that's who Kelly Telly is, and that's how they were able to predict that she was going to live for 21 more minutes, and that's how they could
mm,
predict everything that was going on in some ways. And there's that idea that, are we living in a singularity, or a
interesting.
construction of time that's been designed, and we're just playthings in much the same way? It sort of gives me that vibe, but you only get that towards the very, very end of it, when we start
Yeah.
to see all this together. And if I sort of feel like if all the stories were told in reverse, I think it would read a lot better, if in a lot of
Mm,
senses. But it's classic sci-fi of that time, I think, insofar as they tend to do it all at the end, kind of
mm,
have you wade through all of this. What is this person talking about? What's going on? None of this reads very well. I don't have no idea where to place this or see it. Whereas I think we've been talking about Children of Time. It totally does the opposite. It does all the setup at the start. It talks about the generations, and you can see how we get confused about this, because that thing about Gentacost and Smell, with that kind of handing down in the name, is exactly what happens in Children of Time, but it
yeah.
happens at the very start of the book. And I think you see the evolution of sci-fi storytelling quite clearly between
Mm,
these two things side by side, but it also makes it really confusing sometimes to discern what is one story and what's another story.
yeah. 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 When you
But
read them
but
all together. So, sorry, go ahead, Cesar.
I didn't read the introduction for fear of spoilers, but it was deliberately written this way, or is just a compilation of short stories that the author wrote through
No,
several years and then they assembled in a.
they assembled it at the end, but I think he may have assembled it in some ways as a sort of collection of the threads of this story, because they appeared like one every other year, just short stories and like amazing stories, that kind of stuff. But it's very
Mhm.
clear, I think, from when he was doing that, and because of the timeline they've been able to put together, even though they've lost his note spell accounts, they have it definitive, but people agree on this, that it was intentionally done, that he was setting out these little fragments of this bigger world and this bigger story that he was putting together. And maybe he did get some pushback at the time to say, like, oh, I like your inventiveness stories, but like, what does it all mean? And it was his later stories that started to pull it together. But like Jared was saying earlier on, maybe as it got towards the end, because he did die. Yeah, he died quite young. He never
He
really
did, yeah.
got to do finish an awful lot of this off. And you sort of get the sense that he was kind of doing this tapestry effect of like little episodes within a world, you know, almost like here's a short story of this. Because at the start, like you say, none of it seems to connect together. It is literally just the ramblings of here's a romance story told in this weird context. Here's a story about cats told in this weird context. And as soon as you get through I was fascinated to see how people would get on with this, because I felt this was the most Gene Wolfe-like book that we've had in some ways, because it's another one that you think those things are disparate. And as you read through the stories, you kind of realize, there's more stretching going across these. Now, obviously, he only has 3 stories to do amongst, and I think it's very easy to see the parallels in that. Whereas this one, I think it said last night to you, I sort of just need to read it again, because I feel like there's a lot more in here that maybe he intended or didn't intend. Maybe this is all part of the fun of being a writer. You can go, let's have a play.
Well, there's a lot of chaos in the first half of the book,
sure.
And it's like, I think you're right in that he was trying to tie it up later, and that I think because there's a lot of beginning notes in some of the first stories that kind of hints that you shouldn't believe all this, like this may or may not have happened, you know. And so I think that's kind of deliberate in the fact that it was all just like Suzanne said, just short stories thrown out in magazines at first, and then I think as time went on, I think you're right. I think he went and said, okay, I need to tie this stuff together and make it into a single universe, whatever. And because the later stories seem like they try to do that, and actually make things make sense from beginning to end. So it might have been a course correction on his part, you know, once he realized he can put out more stories and he can actually do this stuff, you know. And I think that seems to be what it is.
Okay, I didn't get that far.
Yeah, I checked the copyright times, like, because these are chronological order, not the publication order, but I think the last stories were largely published around the same time. So what you said makes sense.
Right around his death, around that kind of pace. I wonder actually, and it'll be interesting to see when we read in Australia as it comes on. I wonder if that all happened around the same time as he decided to write the novel, in which he kind of thought, right, I do want to write in this world, but in order to do that, I'm going to have to kind of put some structure to the stories that I've told whatsoever, so that my novel makes sense in old North Australia.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
And speaking of old North Australia,
Yeah.
how about Mother Hitton's Little Kittens?
Great. I love this story.
I saw the name and I'm like, oh no, another wacky story, right? But then as I got into it though, I liked how this one was kind of like a spy story.
Yeah.
And that I was like, oh, this guy is like a James Bond, and here we go. And I was like, this is pretty interesting. This Benja coming. What a stupid name. Benja coming. Yeah. But he, you know, he's associated with this guild of thieves on another planet, and he's trying to infiltrate an Australia society here, and he's trying to get I forget what he was after. He was trying to rob him, and it was this really cool spy setup. It's very James Bond like, just you know, it's set in this wacky setting, sci-fi future, but he's getting all this stuff together, and he's masquerading as a tourist, and it's all this cool setup. And then at the end, I think he dies, I believe. Right?
Yes, he does. Yeah.
And he gets thwarted by these sonic minks.
Yeah.
I was just like, I cracked up. I was like, that, and that's the point where I was just like, this guy's some kind of weird mad genius.
I got that as well.
he's crazy, but he's pulling off some weird stuff here, and I really liked like there was the theme in this story was kind of it was only really maybe it goes through the whole book, but it really stood out in this story that he's describing all this stuff he's doing to get this job done, and he comes to the conclusion that sin is a lot of work. You know,
Yeah,
crime is a lot of work, and it kind of goes against what the instrumentality in Australia were trying to do for people, make everything super easy and utopian. And he's like, no, I'm working against this. And so it kind of fits in with that theme of utopia isn't all it's
yeah,
met out to be or whatever it is. And he's doing all this work to go against the rule of law and to go against what society says he should be doing, and that was really pointed out in this story, and the most telling line was the eyes of men and women are bright on Olympia, for they see nothing. And that
Mhm.
refers to one of the planets he went to, but it was just an excellent line in there that just said, when you have that kind of a bright utopian society, you end up seeing nothing. And
Yeah,
it just that was pretty profound, and I really liked that line, which is what really in this story stood out the most to me for those reasons. Whatever the silly conclusion of him being taken out by sonic minks, that was ridiculous, but it was kind of fun though. But the whole setup of that story and the whole theme behind it was what I thought was brilliant.
yeah. And a retelling of the Alibaba story in some ways. So that bigger score, there's a cave that has got
Yeah,
untold riches that you can go
yeah,
and find, and actually the greed that goes in that, like it's talked about in this story, that he's going to spend all his money to get to that final score, even though he's got a lot of wealth, all that kind of stuff. But the actual death of the young boy Johnny was really upset. Did you not find, like, I found it really horrific in the way he manipulated and murdered that kid at the
oh
start?
yeah, that was horrible. Yeah, yeah, and and that was that was part of the all the work he
Yeah,
had to like the sin was so much work for him to do, and it was and that part of it, like he had no scruples whatsoever when it came to pulling that off, and he was willing to also kill the mother, I think,
that's right.
but he ended up not having to. But um, which I don't know if that might even be worse for the mother, But it was just, it was yeah. He wasn't a great guy at all. He was not he was definitely a protagonist, but not a hero, and so it was just a fascinating part of the story. And I would have liked to have seen more of that world dynamic he had for this story, because this is
Yeah.
only a small time period in the whole greater timeline, and it would have been neat to see more, because he comes from a different world with thieves guilds, and he goes to this other world, Olympia, to get this prize, and he's also on in Australia, and I really liked the whole dynamic of that setting, and I would have liked to have seen more of it, rather than some of the other crazy stuff in the beginning of the book here.
A couple of other really fascinating points about this. I found a lot of parallels, especially in the story with PK Dick and DeAndre's Dream. So that idea of the Sonic, isn't it, cats? So all their anger and churn is basically put into an emotion device, which is
Minx,
exactly what happens. The Minx
Minx, yeah,
was put into an emotion device for rebroadcast and amplification, which is essentially what the Mercerism was doing in DeAndre's Dream. That kind of idea that you can sort of control and manipulate people's emotions by capturing raw emotion and amplifying it louder. And I kind of thought it a bit weird. The final story has a character called Mercer in it. in some ways, and there's a couple of points throughout it. I kind of go, this is very PK Dick the whole way through, like almost like a precursor to a lot of his ideas that he kind of took and ran with. And I sort of would almost bet money that he was a fan of Cordwainer Smith's short stories in some ways, because he takes some of
That
those
yeah,
ideas and amplifies them out.
that wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, I thought of PK Dick too, but not in this context. It was in the context of the fact that the instrumentality keeps humans forcefully happy. And
Mm,
the opening of To
yeah,
Androids has this device where you can inject yourself with whatever emotion you want
that's
for
right.
the day. And the wife and the husband have this argument that that she wants to feel something. Like she
Yeah.
wants to allow herself to feel sad. And I think that is sort of a recurring theme throughout all the stories in this book. And it starts in a very similar vein with the scanner yelling at his wife.
Hmm.
Also, the roles are reversed that he wants to feel something, so he's
Yeah.
going to what? Crunch? Is that
Yes. Oh God.
that was hilarious too. But yeah, I think that's where I thought of PK Dick. But yeah, it's interesting that we both thought of To Android Stream of Electric Sheep. So I would be very curious to see if this collection was an influence for that story.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, Alpha Boulevard has that key question in it as well of the woman who wants to know whether she's fated to be with man, whether it's true love. She just wants to know if it's her choice, that the life she's living
Yeah.
is her life, and whether that'll make all the difference to her. And that sort of prediction machine that she had beforehand is kind of like totally messing with, again, liberty, free will, all of the stuff that appears throughout the story. Just
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Are you Yeah, I loved the exploration of that question. I think particularly in that story, but in general throughout the collection of if you are forced to feel a certain way, is that good
Mhm.
or bad? Or if you um the negative emotions aren't all that negative if you are allowed to feel them. I think the freedom of choice versus perpetual happiness. I think the exploration of like which is better. I Obviously there are no clear answers, I think, and maybe different people would choose different things based on what they prefer. But the raising the question as we talk about, just giving us something to think about, I think
Yeah.
is pretty cool.
And even the husband in that regard, kind of, he doesn't say it there because he's afraid to say it, but he's like, at the end of the day, what difference does it make? You know, whether you have free choice or whether you're being told to do it. The end result is we'll still be happy together and we'll still
Mm,
live our life in some ways. And again, it's a big question of you're reading along going, like, this is a stupid story about a lot of dumb kind of
yeah,
stuff. And yet dropped in the middle of it is like big philosophical questions in some way, shape, or form
yeah,
for you to kind of ravel your head around and kind of distract yourself from the cats and the drats and the dragons and the
yeah,
the people and the goats.
yeah. I I think the ideas are pretty big. She doesn't skimp on the
Yeah,
kinds of things that he's exploring at all. And yeah, how he's getting there is pretty I don't know about unique, but interesting. I guess it's unique. I haven't read anything else quite like
yeah.
this. Yeah.
There's nothing like. Well, I think you also have to consider that we did read this as a collected group of stories, but they would have just appeared one every 2 years in a
Mm,
magazine, and you'd have been
yeah.
waiting a Cordwainer Smith story, going, "Oh, he's absolutely out there. He's wacky."
Yeah.
I'm going to read a bit of this and I'll get a philosophical question in the middle of it. So he probably had a large fan base because of the delivery method of that at the time.
Mm,
It's only when we're trying to put this together as a coherent kind of thing, like I think it's fair to say, it's not very, it doesn't congeal very well together, it doesn't flow well, it doesn't necessarily follow along, and you have to get a long way into the book before you even start to see or know that there's any
mm,
uh, correlation
yeah.
between the stories.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree. I think it might be best read in small doses. I was doing fine while I was reading one story a day. It was just after the Dead Lady of Clowntown, I had the rest to finish before our discussion in
Yeah.
2 days, and it. I think it was the weirdness. I don't want to say too much, but
Yeah.
it was strange enough that I think it didn't distract from the main themes. I still got a lot out of reading those stories, but I didn't I wouldn't go so far as to say I liked any of the later stories, if that makes sense. Yeah. So Susanna, do you want to talk about this. Oh, I forget the name of the story. The Suzral one.
Yeah, the crime and the glory of Commander Susta,
Oh,
who made an
Suzral.
appearance in the last story again.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I gave up on that one. So apparently it gets better, or the stories get better toward the end. But there was nothing, even in the first stories. I think I DNF'd the first one, thinking, okay, this is bad, but let's try the next one. And then pretty much the same on the next one. I think this is even worse. Okay, let's try the next one. Sadly, nothing worked for me. Not the prose, not the characters, not the weirdness of it. Nothing was working. And then I get to that story and read that line, and that was that. When the discussion was postponed, I then came back and gave it another shot. Okay, I will pass this one as well, and I'm going to try to read since I have more time. And God, I was losing the will to live. So I really don't have much to say. There might be a method to the madness. That's why I asked if he published this way, but it does seem that he was just having random ideas and, oh, wouldn't it be cool if kind of ideas, and was publishing in a format that allowed that. And if they were being published with such gaps in between, to give time to the readers to read it several times and speculate and philosophize and maybe look into stuff that might not be there. Because honestly, I don't see any depth to it. It just seems like he was just throwing words on the page, like I don't know what he was on, but it does feel like the work of someone under the influence of something, and just, oh, wouldn't it be a cool idea? Let's explore. But nothing was working for me, story after story, and then I stopped because I was getting angry. So
Yeah, I feel you.
Sorry.
I understand totally, because when I was reading The Dead Lady of Clowntown, I was getting to that point where I was like, okay, what is going on here? What is the point of this? And he throws out an occasional, like, really interesting idea, like like when like in the very beginning of the story, he says the loving care of a hospital might give one of the under people an idea, and that would be bad. So stuff like that is can be profound in the right situation and right setting, but the rest of the story is so damn weird.
and
You
the
throw it
little
off.
rhymes or songs, or what the hell is this?
A
That's
lot of
actually
those, yeah.
where I stop. Other women hate me. Men never touch me. I am too much me. I'll be a witch. I was like, what? And then is this? It's just out of the blue. So what? It was even worse than before. Now, I don't like to speculate about the mental state of a writer, because I will not throw stones when I have glass ceilings and all that. But Jesus, who comes up with this idea that femininity becomes carcinogenic? That's twisted. This whole story was so twisted. I was barely holding the book at some point. I was like, this is bad for my mental health.
But was it? It wasn't the femininity was carcinogenic. It was estrogen, wasn't it? It was the female
Well,
hormone.
basically,
Yeah.
Yeah, it was just so twisted. So it just and what's up with all the cats? It's just I just couldn't get over
Yeah.
it. So
He obviously liked cats. I think. Now, one of the things I actually took from that story, it wasn't necessarily so much as being misogynistic, which obviously, being a man, it's probably right on course for that. But it was this idea that if everybody had to become male to survive, and they were in a period, they were going back in time to a society like today, all the literature, all of the kind of stuff would be referring to as a two gender species, and yet they were all a singular gender. Like, how messed up is that experience for everybody insofar as doing it. Now, he probably could have killed off all the men, they all became women, and all the rest of it in just much the same way. But I kind of thought some of that was, again, very philosophically very interesting, especially in a modern society where gender is pretty much the hot topic of current life. You know, then again, this in 1953, something like that, that he's sort of exploring that as an idea. But
No,
your experience may vary.
Idea-wise, or the ideas, I mean, are not bad. I mean, again, it's unique. This
Yeah.
book again is unique. Compared with all the other ones, there's very little. I liked the analogy you did with the android dream with the electric sheep. I think you're probably onto something. But still, the way that it was explored, it really didn't work for me
Yeah.
in any sense. So, sorry.
But for that story in particular, I think I had a bad reaction to those lines too. But where it went from there, I think changed my opinion a little bit. I don't think he was like, he wasn't being negative towards females. I don't think he was more exploring a society where women don't exist. I think this feels similar to some other stories written by women, I think, that we've read as part of the Speculative Speculations podcast, where they explore what what a matriarchal society might look like, or if there's a role reversal and so on. So it was interesting to me that the final state of the society is pretty warlike, and they keep looking for fights, and they hate each other, hate themselves, hate, I guess, the people who they originated from, and so on and so forth. And I don't necessarily agree with the point that it's making, that if that males have control of the universe, then there will only be war. I think that was similar to the point that some other stories that the that the women wrote makes. But I think I read it as an exploration of what a male only society might be. And in that sense, it helped me to not rail against the fact that he decided women are all carcinogenic.
Well, he does say right in here, a bad idea can spread like a mutated germ.
Yeah.
And I think he was showing us that, that was probably a bad idea to have that kind of a society.
Yeah. The Dead Lady of Clowntown, right, being the book or the story that's by far and away the longest, I think, in it.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting touchstone for the entire book in a lot of ways, because I feel like it is the turning point of the book in a lot of ways, from the kind of some madcap nature and very scatterbrain, run of ideas to trying to build together some sort of central themes throughout all of these stories. And there's no doubt its length is somewhat perplexing in a lot of ways, including the kind of idea that it's formed around this character Elaine rather than De Joan, not Joan d'Arc, but De Joan, dog Joan. But there were some, like, towards the end of that story, I think I mentioned this last night, there is an incredibly powerful scene with the woman who is holding her rat babies and begging the soldier just to either have mercy, but not just see them as people. That's all she's asking. Saying you can kill them, you can do whatever, but just see me as being the same as you. That's all that I want. You can kill me, strike down, and he can't handle it, and he ends up striking them all down and murdering them all. And I have some bits of that story because of the way it was expressed and the way that it was told the whole way along. I just thought it was so popular. Like, what I have the bit here. You're my brother, even though my blood is rat blood and yours is human. We share a common speech, common hopes, common fears, and common death. That is what Joan has taught us all. Death is not bad, soldier. It just comes badly sometimes, but you will remember me after you've killed me and my babies. You'll remember that I love you now. And I was like, holy crap. And in the midst of this, like, very long, drawn out kind of rebellion story, as it was kind of promised one in a lot of ways, that there's going to be someone to come, even though it kind of shared a lot with the Matrix insofar as like Joan wasn't a singular character. She was again a lineage of characters that was brought back again and again and again and again, to the point that it would come to do that this was the kind of the result of that at the end. And I was like, okay, I think that was the real point in the book where I went, there's much more going on here now than the cats, the rats, the dragons, all of that kind of mad stuff that's going on in this book from story to story, because he's things that really he's to say about society in this, and how we treat people, and how we treat all genders, and how we treat cultures, and how we treat even animals or otherwise, and people with different places in society. So yeah, that part of the story was the turning point of the entire book for me, because I was much like everybody else in the chat up that stage. I was like, I mean, it has some nice ideas, but it's random as all hell.
Yeah, it's interesting that you brought up the Matrix, because I did think about that as well at certain points.
Yeah.
And it's funny because we've been doing a lot of reading of old science fiction, and it's just fascinating to watch the evolution of science fiction as it came. It was just this burgeoning, genre to start with, that was bordering on just barely getting the science in there, to getting into more science, but also more wacky and crazy ideas that just went way beyond the bounds of what was possible. And then so you can kind of see from some of the earlier stories we read where he might have got some of his ideas, and now we see, like we mentioned Phil K. Dick, and we mentioned the Matrix, and we see some of the ideas germinating outwards into the future of sci-fi, and how people have latched on, because you could probably pick 1,000 modern stories that have a germ of an idea that might have been introduced in this book alone, but also in the stuff before it. And it's just it really is fascinating going through all these the big book of science fiction, and then all these masterworks, and just seeing all this stuff being relatable or related in some manner, one way or another.
Fantastic point. And as we've said before in previous discussions, these 10 books that we've done so far are all phenomenally different from each other. Like there was no template for this. This wasn't a template that people were following. This was original thought and original idea. And there's even a part in the afterword where Cordwainer Smith kind of addresses the fact that a lot of people kind of run science fiction down as like pulpy, or the escapist at fantasist kind of stuff. And he said something to the effect of, well, I think you'll find that science fiction as a genre of literature has way more PhDs than any other part of writing or otherwise, and it's that idea of that novum, or that idea that kind of is it like a germ that kind of starts and spreads throughout stories throughout time, is definitely something we see throughout a lot of these books.
Absolutely. I still don't think it was a masterwork. That was my review.
You were as far away from thinking it was a masterwork.
I might change. I was very angry with like that. This is a piece of work, but it's not a masterwork. And it's just because it was compiled. Like for me, a collection of short stories. They're not particularly short, or novellas. It's not a novel for me. It can be a masterwork. It has to be a full work. And I don't think this was written with the intention of being a whole. It just kind of happened, and so for me, should it be a masterwork? It was original, innovative for the time, sure, but I don't know. This is one of those, like it's a Cities in Flight. Yeah, it's definitely.
Well,
for me.
The only thing I'll say to that is I may be overreaching a little bit with the masterwork, considering I knew what the general feeling within the room was going to be around these stories. But Fifth Head of Cerberus wasn't originally supposed to be a novel in much the same way. It was 3 short stories as well. And you can consider it a master. I think you can have the ideas and kind of put together. It depends what you're kind of framing as a masterwork, I suppose, in a lot of ways. For me, I'm looking for something that really makes me think, that really changes the way that I perceive stories in a way that you don't really see every day within general fiction. Again, that no template thing, that idea that somebody's done something incredibly different, maybe by accident in some ways, because he didn't write an awful lot of stuff himself. It might have just happened for him. But for me, the more that I got in the story, and I'm just kind of sad that I've really not many more stories that this man kind of put together in this universe, to kind of enrich the kind of ideas that he had even more, which is a bit sad because of the way he wrote.
Yeah, that's what I was saying about that little kitten story.
Yeah.
I would have liked to have seen that definitely expanded
Yeah.
upon that setting there. But
Good idea.
yeah, and that's what it's all about. These ideas.
Yeah.
Really is.
Yeah. I want to talk about the actual story for a bit more. The Dead Lady of Clowntown. I I liked, so there were things I like, pretty much everything, every story in this book. There were things I liked and appreciated very much, and there were some things that bothered me a little bit. Like, I really liked the whole yeah, I think I agree with you, Chris, that this is where it changes and it doubles down. I wouldn't say it's where it starts, but it starts to double down on some of the
That's a good point.
larger themes and about, freedoms and equality and so on and so forth. But so I really appreciated the introduction of that, and I think there was a certain element of is this universe deterministic that you were talking about earlier with, the lady. I think it's explained away a little bit. The lady Punk Ashash, who's apparently named for 5 and 6 in Hindi, so it should technically technically be pronounced Panche, but the um, audiobook narrator called her Pankashash, so I'll call her that too. Anyway, so she knew that Elaine would come, and there is a person called Dijon. At first, you start to think that this, how the hell did she know? Like, is everything pre-known in this universe and so on? But you find out, and I thought this was really cool, that they permanently keep someone named Dijon and
Yeah.
planted with all the memories, so that she's ready for revolution whenever it might come. And Eliza, is that her name?
Elaine.
Elaine, sorry. Yeah, Elaine. I'm confusing it with
Eliza,
another.
Eliza from the other book, yeah.
so Elaine is also a placeholder. She's just someone who was dissatisfied with what she had, and so someone was eventually bound to show up here with. And I love the beginning where a bunch of crystals made a mistake, and
I love that, but I
and
thought it was great.
yeah, and I love that the humans have numbers and that the under people have human names, which goes back to what you were saying earlier about the under people being more people than the humans themselves, because they've been given numeric names. With all that said, I I felt like, so the main part of the story, I think, is centered a little bit around non-violent resistance, right? And I appreciated the use of that theme, but not quite how it was put to use. It was
Yeah.
almost caricaturish, and I I feel like it's impractical the way it was depicted. So we don't see that kind of thing very often in stories. So when it's there, I would like for it to be done well, and it was thoughtful. I just feel like there wasn't sufficient depth to
Yeah.
it. Just having a bunch of people say I love you back to the people who are murdering their children, I don't that feels like a mockery of a concept rather than a sufficient exploration of it. Like, that's how surface level it felt to me. I know the author didn't intend it as a mockery. I think he probably did mean to say that this is a good thing, but the way it was put to use, I did not think was sufficiently well done.
I agree. I think the story has problems, certainly both in terms of how the whole story is kind of put together, and and portray it out. And like you say, it kind of stops a bit short of actually making a point, which of all the stories in the book, I think this is the one that really tried to make a point, or really tried to push a certain idea forward. One final thought about that book from me, or that story from me. Do you think Pankashess is also a Kelly Telly?
Oh, interesting. Like the computer in Alpha Street.
Yeah.
Ooh.
They're all the same thing. Again, that idea that they're living in a
Yeah.
singularity simulation, that there's something actually controlling what's going on here, like pushing and pulling society in one way, is in like a design kind of sense, because there is the sense that there's over beings that are not the instrumentality, that they are kind of sitting the next level above, or certainly are worked in the background.
I like that. I didn't think of that, but yeah, it fits, doesn't it? That
Yeah.
even if he didn't intend it, I think that would be a valid reading of the connection between the stories. Yeah, I like that. I like that.
I'm gonna change my name to Kelly Telly. It's or Telly Kelly, whichever way around it goes. That's a cool name.
Yeah, I agree. It is.
Especially again, it was introduced really sillily as well with her. You know, where he was reading her mind and he spelled it out phonetically rather than actually how it's going. I was going, what is happening here?
Yeah.
It's having a fit.
And normally, when people do that, there's usually a reveal to, oh, it was actually this word that you knew all along.
Yeah,
But it was.
I read it like 3 or 4 times, going, but what is it electric? Is that what she's trying to say? Or no, but it actually was a Kelly
No,
Telly.
that's exactly what she was pronouncing. It is written as it sounds, and it makes no bloody sense.
Yeah.
I better see that name on your screen next time we meet up.
Yeah, well, that's true. That's true. Okay. Krista Kelly Telly Moon. Yeah, that's me. Yeah.
That's Chris's new channel name.
That's going to be the most niche reference. Actually, is if anybody has searched for other Rediscovery of Man videos on YouTube, I really can't find a review video at all.
Oh,
There
really?
not one as far as I know. So like that is confirmed the most niche reference in all of YouTube.
Zero
man.
search results.
Kelly Telly, what is this? Do you mean electric?
And once Chris changes his name, there'll be one search result.
That's right. That's true. That's true. Except
If
it's
you
still gonna
change
say, do you mean? That's all it's going to say. You don't mean to search
Yeah.
for this guy's name. That's
That's still gonna happen.
I promise, Chris, if you change your name, I will search every day for that name.
Do you mean the Library of Alexandria?
The number of results won't change, though.
Yes.
But Chris might become more popular if you keep searching
I
and
mean, I
reading
couldn't
the
become
SEO.
less. So there we go.
Oh, man.
You need a cat thumbnail to go with that.
No, all that'll happen then, Jared, is they'll think I'm trying to be hacked. There'll be some supercomputer because it still comes from the same region of the world, trying to find the answer to life's questions and who Kelly Telly is.
The answer's 42. We all know.
The answer's 42, indeed.
Yeah, that's correct.
So,
Oh, man.
so one other thing that I wanted to bring up, like just a specific story that I wanted to chat about more, which I feel like I should have picked that instead of the rat and dragon one, because thinking about it now, I liked it more. Under Old Earth, which I think okay, putting aside how it ended, what the heck, why did he flood the place? But this, I think there were several things I liked about the story. One, that it was an explicit exploration of that theme that I've mentioned several times already, of injected happiness. Is it a good thing or not? But the main thing why I loved this story was the description of those planets that all dance together and they are influenced by each other's magnetic fields. And the guy who's channeling them, there's through his drums. Oh my God, that's that is so amazing. Just thinking about that these 7 planets together have this consciousness, and you mentioned that there are other beings outside the instrumentality. This apparently is the only story where he mentions these planets, but you could take that theory and run with it, that these external planets are trying to influence the human society in some fashion, right? And then first, that whole concept I found fascinating with the planets and the channeling through the drums. And then what he sees in this room where he's playing the drums is an aurora with lots of colors and stuff,
Mm.
which, because of the magnetic field of the planets that are changing and stuff, makes a whole lot of sense. And I'm like, there is a method to this madness.
Yeah. Even just dancing around, and it's
Yeah.
kind of like this fever dream in
Yeah.
another way. Yeah.
So I love that. I love that concept of these 7 planets in the same orbit and a dance around each other. It's so brilliant. So
Yeah. What that story, I don't know how I feel about that story, but there is the sense that the main character who goes to investigate, he has enough free will to sacrifice his life. No way supercharges his life so that he kind of can experience it quickly. He has the freedom to do that in order to get the answer of knowledge that he's looking for. Like, that was literally his whole reason for being, and he ends up succeeding in that way. Whereas other people in the story obviously don't have that freedom and don't have that idea that they're in control of what they want to do. And that he sort of frees the girl from the spell of him to make her own free choice, and that's kind of his gift to give to her in some ways. But I there was that bit where it's sort of, I thought it was going to reveal who that person was, if you know what I mean. That was kind of said, I was kind of like, again, getting books mixed up with this will be a joke only for a couple of us here. I thought it's Davian again, isn't it? It's Davian. He's going to say it's Davian. That's exactly this, because it was one of those stories where it was like, right, you know me, you know who I am, don't you? And I'm like, I do. I've been waiting on you. Anyway, there you go.
So I wondered if she was featured in one of the stories that aren't in this collection, because this story was apparently his last work, and so the reveal must mean something to people who have read his story. Like, I don't see why it makes sense without that.
Yeah, it might be in Australia. It might be in the book. That might be something to look out for.
Yeah, maybe that would make sense, because she feels like someone really important, because making that the last line of the story, which, I was going to say, unless you're crazy, but
That fits.
but that just doesn't make sense. But then there are some last lines or last, like, endings in the story that I'm like, what the heck just happened, and why why is this a good way to end this story?
Yeah.
So yeah, I would like to know who she is. I don't know if I care enough to find out, but I think she might be featured in some of the others. I was gonna say something. I forgot. Never mind. But I have a couple more overarching themes that we didn't get to, if that's, unless
Well, how
you
about
guys want to talk about more.
how about the final story, the planet named Sheol.
Sheol.
Sheol, yeah, is that how you say it? But
Yes,
that
please
was,
tell me how it ends. I want to know the ending.
well, it doesn't quite end, but
That you do not want to know.
but this story was fascinating because it was a prison planet, and I found that whole concept fascinating, in that they were sending these people down there, and I think the instrumentality thought they were sending them to be punished, and it turns out that they were being sent there to be given these super pleasure drugs in order to see how they work on this world or whatever, and they were harvesting grown organs from these prisoners that would grow after the fact because of the nature of the planet they were on. And even sometimes it was so weird, it was so strange, but it was very it was very like, you had the whole Dante Inferno type reference.
Yes,
it was a level of hell,
it was.
but the like, some of the prisoners didn't want to leave though, because they wanted that happy drug all the time. It was just like, so you had that, like you were saying earlier, the enforced happiness on a prison population, and it was kind of gruesome when you think about it. And I was just like, wow, that's really out there. And I forget how it ended though. How did it end?
Oh, well, it ends basically when they get moved to another planet, and the robots are going to harvest human cells basically on that planet for the
That's
use of
right. Yeah.
medicine. But yeah, I mean the story's wild in a lot of ways, but again, it's that dichotomy of that utopian society. They basically have a use for these prisoners. They're not going to put them in prison. They're going to damn them for the rest of their life. But because the instrumentality believe in happiness, etc., they're going to give them lots of drugs so they feel like they're having a great time. Whether it's the cap on the head at the start when they go in, or whether it's
Right,
the
yeah.
drugs to keep on going. But at a certain point, they lose the sense of actually why they were there in the first place, or even that there were people there. And enough time passes that people didn't even realize there were people down there that were being kept alive. And it's that idea everybody dies. Sometimes people die eventually, you know, that kind of idea that she keeps on pushing forward and doing that. And like the whole thing, again, it's this fascinating fever dream, because again, we have Sustal that obviously appears. We see the crime that he did, which was saving humanity, as it turns out, and he ended up getting sent shipped to the planet. And then Alvarez became a monster man.
Yep.
Who wasn't alive by the end. Like the whole thing's just completely and utterly bizarre. But by that stage, I was 100% in. I was like, oh yes, this actually, I'm on Cordwainer Smith's level. This makes sense to me now. All of this.
I think that might have been my least favorite story. I did not like reading the gruesome descriptions of the bodies, and I didn't feel like it was making any new points that weren't already made in the previous stories. So it didn't add anything new to me, made me rethink whether I liked some of the stuff I already read.
I really enjoyed the last story. Found it very easy to read. It was very
That it was.
compared to some of the other stories where you kind of inject yourself and dig in a little bit.
Yeah.
This one just kind of flowed off the page. And the poor story of the guy, the Guardian guy, like when you found out why he was doing what he was doing, and at the points that even he'd say, I can't do this with children, like this is wrong.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah, and it was interesting that was a tipping point where he ended up calling somebody in, I think, and then the instrumentality discovered, oh, we set this up. What? Oh, we gotta stop this, you know. And
there's humans there. Yeah, there's thousands of them, 13,000 or something. That was yeah.
And but that was part of his, you know, his kind of his point of the story was like this, that sometimes these governments, or you know, empires, or whatever you want to call them, in charge can inadvertently set up these hells that they don't even realize is going on, and that when they're trying to set up these utopian societies like we were talking about, and it was just like more fuel to the fire for what seems to be his whole point in the book. And but it was really played out in some gruesome descriptions of what these prisoners were going through. And I thought it was very visceral. I thought it was one of his more powerful works of prose in the book, as far as you know, what he was trying to pull off.
Yeah, that when you put it like that, I think I can appreciate it more. I think why I felt a bit turned off by the gruesome descriptions was because, I don't know, I think we were 5 or 6 pages in before we started the descriptions, and I was like, there's 30 pages left in the stories. Are we just going to keep reading about this for 30 more pages? Yeah. and we almost did. So but yeah, I think again, abstracting out the themes, I think it does do a great job there as well. But I think that story is also an interesting addition to the bits that explore, I think, death. This was, I believe, introduced for the first time in the Dijon story, but maybe it was a running thread throughout too. This idea of death and whether to fear it or not fear it, whether and I think it's tied to the enforced happiness aspects of being, but also the difference between knowing that you're going to definitely live for a fixed amount of years versus knowing that you can die at any time, how that affects how you live your life. And how it may or may not add or subtract from your overall happiness and well-being. I think, and I think just generally the fear of death and why you shouldn't, in theory, I think was also explored quite a lot in all these stories. And I think I did appreciate it. I did think that he had a pretty nuanced take on the subject across all the stories.
Yeah. It was I made the point, I can't remember exactly which story, but I'd written in my notes here that essentially when you started life, you were given basically a budget of years to say you're going to live an elongated life of say 400 years, which in theory is the dream of society in a lot of ways, that you will never die or you'll certainly have a choice in your years. But actually what they were doing was they were drugging the population to a certain point. They were supporting that long life with this Santa Clara Stroop drug to keep them alive, and that they could just pull that back at any stage, and basically they were in control essentially. So it was a control mechanism in a free society. You know, that's
Yeah.
those ideas. So yeah, very interesting.
And there's also this aspect of, would you really live your life well if you know that you have a certain amount of time to live, right? I think sorry, you were saying?
No.
Okay. I think I could really relate to why that might be a bad thing, because, we, just how I work with deadlines in general, it's like, yeah, I have a whole week to do this versus now I have only 2 days and I need to scramble. So I feel like if you wanted to do something, you have 400 years, you're like, yeah, I have all the time in the world. And maybe you eventually realize I don't have that much time, and you do all your living towards the end. But then we also see that their bodies are kept artificially alive, like that guy who was taken underground. His body is in terrible state. So
Yeah.
they're surviving. Not and I think even that would be an overstatement of what it is that is being done to these humans. So I think the overall point that you need all the negatives in life to be able to appreciate the goodness. I think I can get behind that. I don't necessarily agree that you should take away all the freedoms. Like in the rediscovery of man, they took away the free medication and the free food. Like I don't feel like that's a bad thing to have, but the rest of it, the permanent happiness and the lifespans without being allowed to feel anything bad, I think those things definitely you probably need to.
Yeah, to your point with, like, especially with the guy with the under old Earth, he had his lifespan was about up when he decided to finally go in and investigate what was under the old Earth. It's like,
Right.
well, what have you been doing this whole time? It's not like you didn't know about these situations and these rumors, because the rumors seem to have been around forever. And I forget what he called that area on Earth, but he waited until he was almost expired to
Right. Yeah.
to
To
do,
live.
kind of like how Vasha waits until we're almost on air to finish the book.
That was the
Yes.
point I thought Varsha was trying to make about if
I
she lived
was.
400
Yeah.
years. Yeah. Her reading
I also
deadlines
meant
could just slip forever and ever and ever and ever.
I also meant work deadlines, but we won't say that on it.
That's very good.
Yeah. What else? I think. Were you saying something? I think almost every story had. I feel like calling it a love story is a bit of a stretch, but some sort of pairing between a man and a woman.
Yeah, there was quite a lot of that. There was a lot of
Yeah.
courtship and a lot of romance. Some would even say this is a romance novel of sorts.
Right. Yeah. A lot of the stories.
Courtship?
Yeah.
Courtship. Yeah.
Sorry.
For some definition of courtship.
Yeah. You mean like the hunter?
Oh my god, what was up with that relationship? What was the point of it? Why? What did it add
like-
to the story? Anyway.
I don't know. She gets there and he's like, "We're gonna be lovers. That's it."
Yeah.
And I'm like, "What?"
I mean, if you really stretch it, you could read again the theme of having things decided for you versus free choice, like a repetition of what we see in the Alpha Boulevard story, where it is decided that these two will be together. and except
Yeah.
these two don't fight about it, they yearn for each other. Well, we see that I was going to say Ilera. What's her name again?
Elaine.
Elaine. Uh, Elaine yearns for it. We don't get Hunter's perspective, but hopefully he likes her as much as she likes him. So
Yeah. But there was lots of that. There was the story where there was the big age difference between the people.
yeah.
And obviously he uses or she uses her life force so that they sort of become the same age and sort of become
Oh yeah.
making an age appropriate relationship. We have the one at the end where you talk about free will and choice. Like the very last bit of the story is where Mercer and the lady decide to get married. But the way that works is the lady says, I'll have him for my husband. He's sort of he keeps me interested in things. He's the only one who I could have a conversation with. I'll have him. He's not asked his opinion at all. He's just kind of wanting to know where his next bit of drug is and stuff. So all of these kind of relationships are odd in some ways,
Yeah.
but
They're
they're
very
all
odd.
sort of like, yeah.
They, except for maybe the lady who sailed the soul, that one was kind of cute, but only just. But the others, none of them are a model relationship. And yeah, I can't say I liked any of them, but it was why I bring it up is I think it was interesting as a recurring theme, which I guess given I don't think sci-fi stories necessarily you have some things that repeat across stories that authors put in so that they can have an audience, right? And I would have thought that that to appeal to their audience rather. And sci-fi stories I think typically tend to have a lot of action to be appealing to the audience. So it's interesting that he kept putting in story after story with some sort of romance angle to it, which it's just interesting. I don't know the larger point I'm trying to make, but it kept coming up. I didn't like most of them, but it was there and it was interesting.
Interesting. Yeah.
Anything else? I'm trying to see what other. Yeah, I think I covered everything that I had written down. Do you guys have more points to bring up?
No, the only other point I have in my notes is actually from the gold in the ship was OOO, which is the worst name of any story in it. Although
Yes.
I have at the end of this my last word, another banger. But Tedesco is the captain of the ship. He actually, again, comes back later on. He obviously has one of the rudimentary cap things that he puts on his head as part of his pleasure and his making himself happy thing. And of course, that is the story with Prince Lovaduck.
Yes.
Yeah, Lovaduck. It's just, I just my favorite name in all of literature, I think. There's just nothing quite like Prince Loveduck, and the fact that we get a backstory for it that really uses his Chinese heritage. So Prince Loveduck had obtained his odd name because he had a Chinesian ancestor who did love ducks in their Peking form. Succulent duck skins brought forth to him ancestral dreams of culinary ecstasy. So he called his kid Prince Loveduck because he really liked Peking duck, probably in pancakes.
Oh man, that's
What's your what's your nickname for what you love?
That's a
trying
good
to
question.
think of mine.
love a filet mignon. That's what I like.
Yes, of course.
Yeah, of course, filet mignon, indeed. Might be Coca-Cola almost certainly, but yeah.
Love a Coca-Cola.
Oh man.
Prince Chris Coca-Duck. We'll go for that.
Yeah, I'm trying to think what I consume in large quantities. Yeah.
Listen to you guys and all the things that I missed and the way that you are describing the book. It's, I know it's a book, but it's like you are describing a cartoon. And I think Chris mentioned that. And maybe that's why it didn't work for me because I can't do cartoons. But it does everything, every story is so out there. It's so wild. The way that it's presented, it's so, I don't know, maybe it was trying to be funny, but no, it's not. But it does kind of read like a cartoon,
Yeah,
which is
that's a
it
pretty
makes
good
it
point.
quite unique in that regard.
Yeah.
Because yeah, it's kind of what it was for me. This book reads like a cartoon.
Yeah, and
So
I agree
I
with
love
you.
this discussions, insights all over.
I think that's a great comparison because yeah,
That's a good way to put it.
because
Yeah.
Yeah, I like it as well.
if I change all the images in my head, few enough as they are, to cartoons, they make a whole lot of sense suddenly. Like the dogs are talking, they're named Dijon.
The
People are
cats fly
going
in
next to a
spaceships. I
bonfire.
mean, yeah.
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 You can also imagine the what do you call the thing when they're running, the trail that they leave behind. I forget what it's called, but you can also imagine additional graphics like that. But yeah,
Yeah.
that's a good comparison.
I like that one a lot.
Hmm.
That's what we can. Yeah. Awesome. Cordwainer Smith, master of cartoon sci-fi.
Yeah, invented
Right in.
Hanna-Barbera. Yeah.
All right then. Yeah, actually, this would be a great collection to make into a cartoon.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you'll be the only way. You need huge amounts of CG to get this on screen, so you might as well just
Yeah.
animate beginning to end.
So, with that, any other closing thoughts before we wrap up?
Everybody go and read this book. It's the greatest book since great books were discovered. Rediscovered, some might say.
Well,
The rediscovery
it
of
is
great-
part of the Masterwork collection, so clearly most people think that it is. So you should read it. Yeah, just again, it is different.
Yeah.
And I think that's the whole point of these discussions in this collection is just letting people know that there are really unusual books out there, and this is one of them, definitely.
It's a unique experience.
For sure.
Unique is a good word. Yeah. Perplexing was another that I wanted to mention way back when Chris brought it up, but, but not good perplexing, not bad.
You don't
I
get
don't
to
know.
take it back.
I don't know what even good perplexing is, but
Yeah, you don't have to.
See, I don't think I've ever blinked as many times through a book. Just it wasn't even reread. It was just stop and just blink and okay, continue. It's just have to digest almost every sentence to see what the hell.
yeah,
So,
yeah. You have to not think about it too much, or just think about it the right amount to sort of stay in that trippy zone to
Yeah.
appreciate the story. All right then. With that, next month or this month, the next book will be Last and First Men by Olaf Stapledon, which we will meet towards the end of June to talk about. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you shortly. Bye.